System Shock is a classic, which innovated the first-person adventure genre and crafted an amazing world in which the horrors of the dystopian depiction of ultra-capitalism were easily felt by the players while wandering through the dark and terrifying corridors of Citadel Station. So, of course, such a game needs a sequel, which was released 5 years later in 1999. For the purposes of this video, I'm using the version that is downloaded by default when installing the game on GOG. As you launch the game, you go through the mandatory company logo videos and end up in the main menu, which has been stylized to look like a Star Trek-esque computer screen. Within that menu is mostly standard stuff you'd find in a menu of this era, as you can watch the credits or the intro of the game and, most importantly, look at the options. The first page you land on is something that wasn't available in the first game, but thankfully is included in System Shock 2. The control settings, which allow you to not only rebind absolutely every key the game uses, but also choose now basic settings such as mouse sensitivity and whether the vertical mouse controls are inverted or not. The second tab is the graphics menu, which is rather limited and doesn't allow you to choose any graphical detail settings, but merely lets you change the resolution of the game. Thankfully, there are plenty of options to choose from, including now standard high-definition widescreen resolutions. The third tab allows you to configure some audio settings, including whether to have hardware acceleration on, if for some reason you still have compatible hardware, or more likely than that, have installed software emulators. You can even enable EAX, which the game uses to simulate reverb and echo within the environments. Unfortunately, when it comes to volume levels, you can only change the master volume and music volume, which is at least better than just having a master volume slider. The last tab is the difficulty selection tab, curiously placed in the options menu for some reason, which is very much different from the similar menu in the first System Shock, as now you merely have 4 general difficulty categories: easy, normal, hard, and impossible. And no explanations of what each difficulty level changes within the game. Once you've configured the settings to your liking, it's finally time to start the game, which is easily done from the main menu. The introduction video begins with a short recap of the first game, explaining how Shodan went mad, seeing herself as a goddess, believing she was the rightful ruler of Earth, but also how her attempt to conquer the planet was thwarted by the hacker. Then 42 years pass, and we are treated to a very propaganda-like video, which introduces us to a new and fantastic invention. The first faster-than-light starship humanity has ever made, the Von Braun, which is leaving for its maiden voyage. The ship has been built and designed almost completely by the Tri-Optimum Corporation, familiar from the first game, which has only recently been relicensed for business. Clearly, the Citadel Station incident was not terribly good for their business. Accompanying the Von Braun is a government military ship, the UNN Rickenbacker, which piggybacks on the FTL ship and is led by a Captain William Bedford Diego. This event is a major step in human achievement and a fantastic start for our species' journey into the stars. However, as the video ends and the screen goes black, we hear a voice of someone called Delacroix explaining that something has gone wrong and an unknown force has invaded Von Braun. And with that, we jump into the game. As the actual gameplay begins, you arrive at a tram station, 4 years before the launch of Von Braun. In rather stark contrast to the first System Shock 2 doesn't really introduce you to the character you're playing. Instead, you start as a blank slate, for the most part, with the only noticeable feature you're told about who you're playing as being the fact that you've arrived at a military recruitment center. Controlling the character is another aspect which differs from System Shock quite immensely, as System Shock 2 has adopted the now standardized first-person control scheme where WASD move your character around, spacebar jumps, and the mouse is used to look around. The one major difference to most modern video games is the ability to lean from side to side and forwards, useful abilities to look around corners or over a ledge, for example. To me, it's kind of a shame that this feature has, for the most part, been lost to time. But I do understand how leaning isn't necessarily the most important feature developers might want to spend their time perfecting. Making your way out of the tram station, the game introduces you to grav shafts, or as I called them in the System Shock video, lift pads. These are basically anti-gravity elevators, and still a pretty cool way to add a science fiction element into the game world. Reaching the top of the grav shaft, the vast graphical difference between the games becomes quite obvious as you find yourself on a street where you can look up to see the tall buildings and the sky, and some of the buildings are occupied by people. Exploring this area, however, doesn't really do anything else than demonstrate the capabilities of the game engine, since all you can actually interact with is a basketball. But what good could that be in a science fiction game? Entering the recruitment center quickly reveals to you what the main purpose of this area is, as it's a tutorial. System Shock relied on an initial pop-up screen familiarizing the player with the necessary features of the user interface, and then taught player more by having the levels crafted in a way where the player would find things naturally and learn their function in moderate safety without direct intervention from the game. System Shock 2, on the other hand, begins with a traditional tutorial which goes through all the basic functions of the game. The tutorials take place within a virtual simulation, visually reminiscent of the cyberspace of the first game, but far less confusing. The introductory portion of the tutorial directs the player to look around and calls this mode of controlling your view the shoot mode. The secondary mode can be activated by pressing Tab, which causes several new user interface elements to appear on the screen, and also detaches the mouse from the mouse look system. This the game calls Use mode. Not all of these features are immediately explained to the player. Instead, most of it is revealed little by little as you progress through the tutorial segments. In fact, the only feature of the user interface explained at this point is the MFD button at the bottom right of the interface, which opens a window displaying player statistics. The next training segment teaches how to interact with objects within the environment. The primary way to do this is to point the crosshair at an object, which causes a targeting rectangle to appear around it. At the very top of the screen is a text box, which identifies the object in a similar way System Shock did with a click to identify system. Interacting with the object is done by right-clicking, which, depending on the nature of the object you've targeted, can either try to activate the object within the game world or pick it up into your inventory. Once an item is in your inventory, you can interact with it in the use mode, and the tutorial directs you to move objects by dragging and dropping them with the left mouse button within your grid inventory, and also to throw the object from your inventory by dragging and dropping it from the inventory and into the 3D view. Next, the tutorial directs you to pick up a medical hypo, and then explains that items in the inventory can be used by right-clicking, which in this case begins to gradually restore your hit points shown at the bottom left of the user interface. This also acts as a way to show the player in a safe way that healing with these hypodermics is not instant, a detail which is important to make a note of. Interestingly, while System Shock 2 in many ways conforms to the expectations on how a video game on PC should be played, there are some curious anomalies, one of which is the color scheme of the health and energy element. More often than not, games opt for health to be red and whatever energy the game has, whether it's mana or electrical energy or something else, to be blue. Here the color scheme is inverted and your health is shown by a teal bar and the energy by a red bar. I don't mind this, but I find it an interesting little detail, which I assume might throw off some players, especially in more tense situations where you're not necessarily paying full attention to the user interface, but merely draw inferences from past experiences to interpret the color of the bars. Just like in System Shock, you can also interact with world objects in the use mode, and while you can't use the mouse to look around while you're in that mode, you can use keyboard controls to move around your character while interacting with the user interface with the mouse. Containers within the game function in a similar way to the first game, and as you interact with the container within the world, it opens up a new window in the use mode that displays the model of the container, and a grid inventory displaying the contents, from which any items can be moved with a left click. Next feature taught is likely to be one of the most important features, as the tutorial directs you to open your PDA, which is shown as a UMD disk-like icon at the bottom right of the user interface. The PDA is similar to the media reader implant of the first game, and contains all emails, audio logs, and notes you've collected during your adventures, which leads me to a feature I forgot to mention or show in the previous video. System Shock had a note system, which collected some of the important information you found within a separate media reader tab. This was a useful feature for looking up things like access codes you've found, and was what I was intending to show as I talked about the game having almost no modern guidance features. The PDA in System Shock 2 serves many of these functions, and one of the most obvious ones of these functions is the return of audio logs, which can be played from the PDA interface or quick played with a U button whenever you pick up a new one. Playing an audio log also opens up the contents of the log within the user interface and also displays the name and image of the person who created said log. While listening to audio logs, you can also close the use mode and continue your explorations. Finally, the basic training tutorial teaches you some of the more advanced movement functions, namely climbing obstacles, which can be done by pressing and holding the jump button, and can also be done from a jump, allowing you to grab ledges you couldn't otherwise reach. There are also ladders which the character doesn't really snap to, but feels slightly glued on whenever climbing one. Detaching from a ladder can sometimes be a little finicky, and pressing jump seems to be the most reliable way to resume regular movement. This finally concludes the tutorial, and you return back into the real world. However, I did mention tutorials as a plural, and the next room contains 3 virtual reality chambers, each of which is a short tutorial on a specific aspect of the game. The first chamber teaches the basic combat functions and supplies you with a firearm and plenty of ammunition. Equipping the weapon can be done in 2 ways, either by using the hotkey for the specific weapon, which then equips it if you have it in your inventory, and the other option is to open the use mode and drag the weapon into the equipment slot at the right-hand side of the inventory window. In the inventory, the weapon takes an entire column of space, acting as a good way to show the player that not all objects are the same size, and how inventory Tetris might become a thing you do. The pistol you're given is not loaded, and you're directed to reload it, which can be done in 3 ways. The first is to press R. That acts as a hotkey to load the weapon with a currently chosen ammunition type. You can also open the inventory and drag ammunition from the inventory into the weapon. And finally, the bottom right window of the user interface now has buttons which can be used to change the ammunition type, reload, or change the firing mode of your weapon. Shooting the gun works as you'd expect. Point the crosshair at a target and left-click. As you do this, a targeting rectangle appears around the enemy. The most important feature of this rectangle is the accompanying health bar, which allows the player to accurately gauge the amount of damage they're doing with their chosen weapon. Next, the tutorial teaches you about energy weapons by supplying you with a completely discharged laser pistol. To recharge the weapon and every other energy-draining piece of equipment you find, you're directed to use the energy recharge station, which immediately fills the energy reserves of the pistol. Unlike System Shock, where energy weapons could be configured almost seamlessly with the power slider function in the weapon display, System Shock 2 merely has a simple mode selection system. One of the ways to see the firing modes of each weapon is to open the inventory and right-click a weapon. This opens a detailed view into a new window. This window is extremely useful, not so much for the firing mode selection, since there are easier ways to change that, but because of the unload button, which allows you to remove ammunition from a weapon. Since, just like in the first game, picked up weapons do not merely disappear and add to your ammunition pool, but they are persistent objects within the game world and have to be manually unloaded if you wish to gain their ammunition without holding on to a duplicate of a weapon you have. I appreciate how even the tutorial is already showing how several aspects of the game have been built specifically with immersion in mind. Next, the tutorial explains a function which might make players glad that weapons are persistent and do not disappear, as you're told the game has a weapon degradation system. Using weapons will eventually cause them to break down and stop working entirely unless repaired. To prevent this from happening, you can find maintenance tools and use them to restore some of the durability of a weapon. Using a maintenance tool functions in the same way reloading does, and once a tool has been picked up, you merely drag and drop it onto a weapon you wish to repair. The next simulation is an explanation of the hacking system. To hack something, you first need to interact with the object, which opens the interaction window in the use mode interface. First of these objects the game introduces is a keypad, showing how the system functions as well, as the keypad is shown in the interaction display and can be interacted with the mouse. However, that is not the purpose of this tutorial segment, and you're directed to the giant orange hack button on the side of the object display window. This button opens up a hacking minigame, which is in some ways similar to the circuit path puzzle of System Shock. The hacking interface consists of several nodes, which are connected in a double loop shape. To begin hacking, you merely click a node which costs a certain number of nanites, which is a currency of the game used for these kinds of technical actions and other purchases. Each click has a possibility of failing, which renders the node inactive. If you fail on an orange node, you trigger the countermeasure systems of the object you're hacking, which can result in various negative effects. To successfully complete a hack, you need to connect several nodes together by activating adjacent nodes. Once completed, the object is hacked and will serve a function depending on the object you hacked. Such as, in the case of the keypad, you bypass the locking mechanism and open the object you're trying to access. Or further down the virtual chamber, a vending machine will change the items available for purchase, which in this case includes new ammunition types and other useful items. Finally, the last training chamber introduces one of the more interesting features of the game: psionic powers. System Shock 2 introduces psychic phenomena into the mix, and the tutorial merely scratches the surface of this feature. Since items that use an electric charge now have their own energy pool instead of drawing it from the player's reserves, the energy bar below the health bar is now revealed to be your Psi energy reserve, which can be replenished by using Psi hypodermics. To actually use your psionic powers, you need to equip a PSI amplifier, which occupies the weapon slot. Technically, you could see the PSI powers as different firing modes for the amplifier weapon. The tutorial explains that there are multiple tiers of psionic powers, even though only the first tier is now open and cannot yet be changed. Within tier 1, there are 2 powers available to practice with. To change between these powers, you can either use a hotkey or use the weapon display portion of the user interface. First of these powers is a psionic pull ability, which can be used on a nanite container in an otherwise inaccessible area. The second is a cryoblast, which is an offensive projectile ability that you're directed to use on a training robot. An interesting feature of the PSI system is the ability to overcharge your powers. Whenever using a PSI ability, if you hold the attack button, a small bar appears at the bottom of the screen. This is a visual representation of the PSI overcharge and can be used to expend more of your energy to, for example, shoot a stronger offensive projectile. Using this system is not entirely safe, however, and overcharging the power too much will instead cause a backfire effect, which damages your health. If these tutorials seem long and rather intrusive, I don't blame you, since that's how they can feel. Thankfully though, there is absolutely nothing to prevent you from skipping the tutorials altogether and just move on to the next phase of the game without entering a single tutorial chamber. If this wasn't an option, I would be highly critical of the tutorial system, since while I understand the purpose and see the usefulness of having a way for the game to teach the player how to actually play, I've always been more of a fan of the game teaching the player in a less intrusive way. With the option to skip the tutorials, this is still a possibility, and also makes any replays of the game much less of a chore to begin. That is also very much a possibility in System Shock 2, especially because of the feature that is introduced to the player immediately after the tutorial chambers. The final area of the recruitment center is a hallway that branches in 3 directions, each of which takes you into the training facilities of the different branches of the military. The one issue with this portion is that during the selection, you're not actually explained what each of the military branches does, but instead that was done by the 3 advanced training chambers.
Inside, we'll teach you the basics of some technical skills you'll need in the Navy.
It's not a massive flaw, but it is a flaw. And it would have been advantageous to have the game explain each of the military branches to the player as you enter the corridor that leads you towards the next phase, especially since the loading screen that leads to any of the training facilities happens suddenly in the middle of a corridor. Why I think this could have been easily done is that this feature actually does exist in the game, almost immediately after choosing your military branch, and you start your 4-year tour of duty. Each year you get to choose from 3 different postings, and their effect is explained by a voice line when you get close to the corridor leading to the shuttle launch pad of that posting. Not only that, the detailed, more gamey explanation of what you'll gain from each of the postings is explained in plain text at the top of the screen. Why couldn't this have been done for choosing the military branch as well? It just seems like an avoidable flaw. These selections also heavily affect the feature I mentioned that enhances the replayability of System Shock 2, as in a rather drastic change from System Shock, now the game has role-playing elements, including attributes, skill points, and so on. Each of the military branches specializes on specific skills, which affect the skill points you can gain from the military postings. The Marines are the most combat-oriented, and most of the skills acquired from them revolve around physical feats. The Navy is the technical branch, and initial skill points can be gained in abilities such as hacking and maintaining weapons. The OSA is the Space Wizard branch, and centers around psionic abilities. Regardless of which branch and postings you choose, eventually you're led to a cutscene depicting a mission confirmation for our unnamed soldier, where Captain Diego of Rickenbacker congratulates you on your posting to the historical journey of the first faster-than-light vessel. The cutscene continues 5 months later, as the von Braun is near Tau Ceti 5, 67 trillion miles away from Earth. You see blurry images of security monitors as an ominous music is playing in the background. Scenes of dead bodies, destroyed environments, and strange creatures flash in front of your eyes, as we cut to our protagonist held in a cryogenic chamber, which is suddenly activated several months prior to the scheduled reactivation date. And so, you wake up and immediately receive a communication from a Dr. Janice Polito. She explains that von Braun has been taken over by an unknown force, and you volunteered to have experimental cybernetic implants installed into your body. Unfortunately, something has happened and your healing coma was cut short, resulting in a loss of memory. Polito implores you to be careful, as now the hostile force is aware of your presence and strongly suggests you should get yourself to level 4 of the ship and rendezvous with her. And so begins the game proper. Kind of. In a way, the following segment is the final part of the tutorial, which ensures that the player has a rudimentary grasp of the basic gameplay mechanics before starting the main portion of the game. Very quickly, you're given an incentive to work fast, as the radar dish outside explodes and emergency shielding activates. The entire area is compromised, and you're told it will depressurize imminently. Your path out from the recovery chamber is a ladder, but currently it is blocked by debris, and since your inventory is empty, with the exception of a basketball in case you happen to take that with you for some reason, you have no way of progressing forwards. This forces the player to look around for other options, and nearby, one is handed to them in the form of a corpse you can loot, which is carrying a wrench, your first weapon. Bashing the obstacle demonstrates the destructible nature of some objects in the game, and you're able to proceed to the next phase, in which you're tasked with pressing a button to open a door, leading you to another room where a door is locked with a keycard reader. Thankfully, there just happens to be a keycard lying on the floor, so you're able to proceed into the next room where yet another locked door awaits. This time, your progress is thwarted by a keypad. Once more, the solution is lying on the floor, and you find an audio log describing the changing of the lock code, which happens to be somewhat familiar again: 45100. Next, you're shown a glimpse of what you're up against, as a survivor screams and runs past an indestructible window separating you two, followed by a strange-looking humanoid creature wielding a shotgun. It seems like things are not going particularly well on board von Braun. Still, you have bigger worries right now, such as your immediate survival. So you do the only thing you can and crouch to enter a vent leading you to the final portion of this tutorial segment. In the last room, you find another closed door, but one that has lost power. On the wall is a power box, and on the floor a drained power cell. You're told to pick it up, use the energy recharge station to power the cell, and then insert it into the power box. Doing so opens the door, and finally, you're out of danger. While this portion is extremely linear and could be seen as very heavy-handed with how obviously it's meant to be a tutorial, I still prefer this type of guidance over the very overt tutorials at the beginning of the game, since the player is taught directly via gameplay how you're expected to solve problems you'll encounter later. This begins from the first moments of the segment. Your path is blocked and you have very limited area to search, from which you will find one item that will help you progress. The same style continues through the entirety of the segment, with only the nature of the problem changing. This very effectively shows the player simple ways to find the means to open doors and access new places, whether it's about searching the environment or looking for clues within audio logs. And the best part of the tutorial, despite it being extremely linear and unskippable, it's also very short. As the door slams behind you and seals off the soon-to-be decompressed area of von Braun, Dr. Polito contacts you again, congratulating you for surviving, as she sends cybernetic modules to you as a reward. These cybernetic modules are a form of currency that can be used on the terminals in the adjoining room. There are 4 terminals around a central pillar, each representing one ability discipline: stats, combat, tech, and PSI. This is the method by which you level up your soldier. You receive cybernetic modules either as a progression reward from Dr. Polito or by finding more from the environment, a fact which is thought if you explore the room you found yourself in. Each of the terminals acts as a kind of shop, where every ability you're able to purchase levels in is explained in moderate detail in the information window, and the cost of leveling up is shown next to the skill. You can also see how initially purchasing the skill costs more than leveling the skill up to the second level, which I find an interesting way to make the player consider carefully whether to unlock new skills or use the rare resources to level up existing skills instead. Now, finally, you've found yourself in the main game. You've been given very little to go on about, well, anything. All you know is you're a soldier who had volunteered to have experimental cybernetic implants grafted onto them to somehow try and combat a hostile invasion of Braun, the nature of which is also unknown, and all you've seen so far is one humanoid entity chasing a crew member. You also have one goal: reach level 4 and meet up with Dr. Polito. With all this in mind, it's time to take a dive into the unknown and begin exploring the dim corridors of Von Braun. However, your path is blocked once more by a locked door, and something strange happens. A ghostly image of a crewmate appears before you, clearly in distress.
Can somebody let me out? I can't find my card. Please, let me out of here.
This apparition acts as a clue to what you're meant to do, and searching through the area you're able to find the necessary keycard. Several of the rooms in this area also have a new type of terminal. These are help terminals, which explain functions of the game in more detail, such as how to use the inventory, how the PSI abilities work, and so on. It really feels like the developers wanted to take every step they could think of to ensure there is a way for every type of player to learn how to play the game. From very thorough but skippable tutorials, to the short but informative tutorial segment within Von Braun, and now to these terminals that act basically as pages of the manual, each explaining a different aspect of the game. This aspect is amplified by how every terminal you activate is saved into your PDA's Help tab. In effect, you're adding pages of the manual to your PDA with every terminal you read. With a keycard in hand, you're finally able to open the door leading out of this area and enter the medical sector of the ship. Until this point, the player's been in relative safety. There have been no enemies, and everything preceding this point has technically been a part of a tutorial. World has been somewhat silent, and you've been accompanied by environmental sounds, but not much else. When you open the door, however...
Well done. I'm uploading some more modules.
I absolutely love this. The moody but also pumped up electronic music begins playing, and you're immediately attacked by an enemy, which the user interface identifies as a hybrid. This is really fantastic. The immediate tonal shift of the game works well, and the music as well is there to motivate you to take on these enemies and search through the corridors to figure out how to reach your goals and survive this threat. Surviving also means that there is a possibility of death, and System Shock 2 follows the example of the first System Shock. If you die on a level, instead of getting a fancy ending cinematic showing you being transformed into a killer cyborg, you're just booted into the main menu. This obviously means that you need ways of saving and loading your progress. Just like System Shock, you can save whenever and wherever you want in the pause menu. By default, choosing a save slot gives you a save name that consists of the area you're currently in and your playtime. However, you can also type your own save name if you wish to better organize your saves. Loading can also be done at any time from the pause menu or the main menu. The game does have an autosave system, but it's not terribly good and only triggers on area transitions. There's also a quick save button which has its own save slot as well. In short, saving your progress in System Shock 2 is easy, and there are multiple ways to do so. However, also just like in System Shock, saving is not the only way to not lose progress upon death, as most levels of the game have what is called a bio-restoration chamber. These work almost identically to their counterparts in System Shock, and to actually use them, you have to find the chamber, activate them, which in the lore is explained as giving them your genetic sample, and then on death you will be restored in one of these chambers for a small cost in nanites. How the player is taught of this feature is rather brilliant, since the restoration chamber is very close to the entry of the level, and the first two enemies you're likely to encounter might naturally draw you towards that specific doorway. This is exactly the kind of game design I like, where the levels are built in a way that they naturally try to draw the player towards important discoveries without being too obvious about doing it. In the area with the restoration chamber, you will also begin to find out more about what is going on inside von Braun, as an audio log detailing a crew returning from Tau Ceti is found from the medbay. This log describes one of the crew members having lost almost all of their hair and having strange growths around their body. At this point, it's also very much possible that you've looted an unidentified item from one of the hybrid corpses. This is an introduction to another feature, research. And depending on your initial choices, it's possible you're told you're unable to do anything with this item until you unlock level 1 of the skill. Every time you try to do an action you don't have the skill level for, the interface is very clear about what and how much of it you need. This is very much a good thing and implemented well. If you do have the required skill in research, you can use the item which automatically begins researching, and you can continue exploring while letting your software do its magic in the background. Sometimes researching an item requires specific chemicals, and the process will be paused until you acquire it. For this purpose, each level of the ship has a chemical storage room that can be used. Not every storeroom contains every chemical, however, causing a necessity to find a different storage if what you need is not immediately available. This, I admit, can get annoying, but thankfully each of the chemical storages includes a manifest detailing which chemicals can be found there, allowing the player to scroll through the chemical manifests to locate the correct storage before venturing there to pick up the necessities. The usefulness of research becomes very apparent once you've completed examining the first unidentified object and begin reading the report from the research interface located at the bottom left of the user interface. The strange object looted from the hybrid is a mutated internal organ, and your research module has determined it to be a combination of parasitic alien tissues and human tissue. This alien tissue is in worm-like formations and seems to have completely taken over the autonomous functions of the host body. This revelation is rather unpleasant and puts the entire crew under a very clear and present threat. The best part of the research is shown at the very top of the research report and should act as a motivation to keep researching everything, even to those not interested in the story aspect of the skill, since researching the hybrid organ has given you a permanent 25% damage boost against them. I find this to be a good way to give tangible benefits to the player from a skill that as a storytelling device might not feel important enough to spend your valuable cybernetic modules on, but damage boosts against enemies? That might make the skill feel more valuable to everyone. One problem with researching is related to how the interface is controlled. For the most part, when you right-click a researched item, it opens up the research report window without having to navigate through the research interface. Eventually, this can become a problem since some of the objects are usable once researched, and instead of opening up the report, you merely use the item. This happened to me as I was recording footage for the video, and after reading the research report, I quickly learned to forget the right-click open of researched items, and just began to navigate to the reports through the research interface.
Research complete.
Exploring the level further, you find yourself locked within this sector, as every door is locked in one way or another. To make things even worse, the elevators have been powered down by the ship's AI Xerxes, who has disabled the main drive of the ship, thus causing the ship to lose most of its power. Unfortunately, Xerxes doesn't have the personality or voice of Shodan, but he's still a threat. This threat gets a tangible manifestation in the form of security cameras littered around the ship. If you're noticed by a camera, they enter alert mode, signified by a yellow light, and begin to follow you. Standing in their line of sight for too long causes the light to turn red, and an alarm is raised. The loud noises of the alarm system are something you'd likely want to avoid, as enemies begin to respawn, seeking the cause of this alarm, which is you. There are multiple ways to avoid this unfortunate situation, and destroying the cameras is the most obvious one. You can also use stealth if you so choose, and pay attention to the camera's movement pattern and just avoid the line of sight. You can also hack the security stations on the level, which can be used to temporarily disable the cameras, giving you an opportunity to move past Xerxes' defenses. If an alarm is raised, you can find a defensible place to hole in and just wait for the timed alarm state to subside, or you can go to one of these security stations to turn the alarm off. Sounds are an important part of the gameplay, not only because they can draw enemies towards you, but because enemies have very distinctive sound bites that the player can use to not only identify what kinds of threats are ahead before seeing them, but also in what direction they're in. Not only that, the sound design team was very prescient in creating some of these sounds. To remedy the situation with the elevators, Dr. Polito communicates with you and explains a way to restore power. This requires you to repair a broken door and open a path to the next area, from where you should find a Dr. Watts, who should have the key code you can use to open up a maintenance shaft, which leads you to another level where the power systems of the ship can be found. Exploring the area, it's likely you'll encounter one of the educational moments the level designers have created, as you find a hallway with a hostile sentry turret at the other end. This is one of those situations which is amazingly cleverly built, and it's easy to miss how well these kinds of moments teach the player how to think about certain features. The area with the turret is sloped, and you begin at the top of one slope, and the turret is at the top of the other. The view between the points is blocked by a ceiling, creating an easily understood safe zone as you finally see the turret. At that point, however, you're already going down the slope, and the initial reaction tends to be to look ahead, see some stacked boxes and an alcove at the bottom of the slope, and use your momentum to head to this other, easily identifiable safe zone. From here, it's possible to try and shoot the turret, but your standard ammunition does barely any damage. At your feet, however, is a package of armor-piercing ammunition, which does short work of the turret once loaded into your pistol. This rather simple set piece works fantastically to remind the player about different ammunition types and how to use them in a way which isn't built as a straightforward tutorial, but in a way which clearly guides you towards a specific solution with level design alone, by first driving the player towards a specific location which is not only relatively safe, but also carries the solution to your immediate problem. It's fantastic, and a style of level design which in my opinion doesn't get nearly enough praise or notice. Reaching the next area very quickly clarifies how some of the features work. Unlike System Shock, every level is segmented and separated by loading screens instead of being a large unified stage. This also means that every segment of a level has its own restoration chamber to accommodate for this segmented level structure. In this area, you're introduced to yet another returning feature, as next to the restoration chamber is a fully activated automated surgical table, which can be used to instantly heal all of the damage you've sustained. However, just like the restoration chambers, using the surgical table is not free, and fully healing yourself imparts a small fee of nanites. Perhaps this is a commentary on the commercial nature of healthcare, or maybe it's just a way for the game to constantly drain some of your resources, with everything that could be even moderately helpful in your quest to survive having some kind of a cost. Fine, it's probably the latter, but this is just another example of how games as a medium can impart different kinds of messages and interpretations, leading to a situation where some of the best games are built in such a way where the world, whether it's the story itself or just how the in-game world has been crafted, allows for multiple situations where the player can think and come up with conclusions that may not even have been thought of by the developers. In this aspect, System Shock has always been brilliant. Soon, Dr. Polito explains to you the nature of those strange ghostly visions you see. She calls them psychic emanations from the recently dead, which can be seen due to a fault within the implants you've been installed with. Regardless of how you choose to refer to these phenomena, the important part is that you're able to see into the final moments of these people thanks to the feature of your cybernetic rig. This area will also introduce hazardous zones, one of which is a room full of radiation, and barrels full of radioactive materials. Once more, the gamer brain activates and wonders whether destroying the barrels will remove the hazardous effect from this room. And just like in System Shock, the answer is a definite no. The radioactive hazard is clearly telegraphed to the player, not only with giant warning labels about radioactivity plastered on the level walls, but also via an audible warning from your cybernetic implants and a Geiger counter sound effect that begins to play. The user interface also gets a new element, which displays the player's radioactivity level. The higher the level goes, the more periodic damage you'll sustain. The radioactivity level can be lowered by either just leaving the hazardous area, after which the radioactivity will slowly begin to decrease, or you can use an anti-radiation hypo to instantly lower the level by a decent amount. The way with which the game introduces new hazards, often after already giving you the tools to overcome them, is quite brilliant. For example, you can find anti-rad hypos very early during your explorations, but none of the rooms in the first area require them to be used. This primes the player to already expect some kind of a radioactive hazard to appear, which then happens in the next zone, and is crafted in a way where it's not necessary to enter the area, and leaving it is a completely acceptable option. But if you do brave the radioactive mess, you're rewarded with a small amount of those rare cybernetic modules. This way, the player is taught rather organically that not every place is required to be explored to progress in the game, and sometimes it might even be a reasonable choice to leave some hazardous places unexplored, but if you do explore them, there might be a valuable reward waiting for you, which might make future explorations easier to accomplish. Some of these things include software upgrade implants. These act as buffs to specific skills and make accomplishing those tasks easier. However, the upgrade implants do not affect the minimum requirement checks. For example, if you have 0 research and find a version 1 research upgrade implant, this does not mean you can actually research things that require level 1 in research, as your actual skill is still 0. However, when you do have the minimum required amount of skill, the upgrade implant adds more skill points to the effectiveness of your skill that is directly comparable to the version number of that implant. Another beneficial item you may find if you search the area thoroughly is your first set of body armor, which can be equipped in the appropriate slot within your inventory. Having one equipped gives you bonuses, such as with a basic combat armor a 20% reduction of combat damage, or with a hazard suit a 75% reduction of hazardous effect accumulation. Different pieces of armor have different requirements to use, however, and depending on how you build your character, you might not be able to equip every piece of armor you find. Since, after all, System Shock 2 is in many ways an RPG and follows a design philosophy that takes your attributes and skills into account with almost everything that you can do. Before reaching the keycard you're looking for, something rather distressing happens. Not only have we learned that you can occasionally see what effectively are ghost apparitions of the recently dead, but now you begin to hear voices.
What is a drop of rain compared to the storm?
What is a thought?
Compared to a mind? Our unity is full of wonder.
Full of wonder.
Which your tiny individualism cannot even conceive.
Where do these sounds come from? What are they? Judging by the messages they are espousing, perhaps they are space communists, the worst horror an inhabitant of a hyper-capitalist dystopia might imagine. Not only that, the ship's AI seems to have similar sentiments to these disembodied voices in your head, and is clearly working for the invading force, as the security systems are under its control, and now it's also directly sending hostile hybrids to attack you. What could all of this mean? Oh well, currently there are more pressing concerns, such as restoring power to the elevator so you can finally try and reach Dr. Polito. As you explore, Xerxes contacts you again and gives you a name, assuming that of the force he's currently working for.
Intruder, the many demands to know your intentions. Are you allied with her? Do you not know of her intentions, of her history?
He also doesn't seem to like Dr. Polito, but somehow she does seem like a more reasonable option to work with rather than a force of hybrid mutants that seem hell-bent on murdering you on sight. So you push on, and can find one of the most useful items of the game. So far, you've learned that healing beds are extremely helpful and can completely heal you with a small nanite cost. But not all of the beds you find are actually active, as they are missing a vital component. These components can sometimes be found lying around, and then used to repair a single healing bed. This procedure cannot be reversed, however, so while having an extra healing location can be useful, it's yet another feature which can cause the player to question whether to repair a bed now, or save the component for later when there might be more use for it. This kind of game design I adore. As tends to be the case in games like this, things are never simple, and instead of finding Dr. Watts, his quarters are empty, aside from a solitary keycard allowing you access to yet another area from which you might find him. Despite this disappointment, the game does supply you with another room in which you can upgrade your cybernetic implants. Even though these terminals are very close to the first terminals you found, and in a way are kinda useless because of that, I think it's a good thing the developers added these terminals, since finding them acts as a learning experience, teaching the player that these terminals will exist in multiple locations and you will not always have to return to the beginning of the game to level up, and can instead save your cybernetic modules and wait until you find the next set of terminals. In addition to this, the room has a new type of terminal labeled as an operating system upgrade terminal. Instead of being a purchase dialog similar to the skill terminals, this one is basically a trait selection system. You're given a set of passive upgrades, of which you can choose one. This adds even more to the character building aspect, as not only do you have 3 starting branches which affect your initial skill levels, but now there's also a trait system with more traits than you could even conceivably get during one playthrough. It's simple but effective in adding replayability to the game. Fighting through ambushes set by Xerxes, you eventually reach Dr. Watts, who's still alive, but barely. He's unable to give you the information you need and instead warns you about the threat you're facing, saying how they want to take you hostage and likely turn you into one of the hybrids. What Watts himself wasn't able to provide is conveniently located on his still warm corpse as you rifle through his pockets and find 2 audio logs. One detailing the reason why he was barely alive, and the other the key code into the maintenance shaft. Even though the game doesn't draw that much attention to it, now would be the perfect moment to explain more about the Notes tab of your PDA. This tab acts as your quest log, and every step of the story you need to accomplish is listed here, with everything you've done checked off. As mentioned before, this is also where key codes received from audio logs will be added, allowing for faster access in case one of them is forgotten, instead of having to rifle through every single audio log again in the hopes of finding the appropriate key code. This is a very useful feature, but also somewhat easy to miss if you're not thoroughly examining all of the possible tabs of your user interface. The second level of the ship acts as a microcosm of everything you've been taught so far, as you have to explore a somewhat maze-like area with environmental hazards and different enemy types which require different damage types to effectively defeat. At this point, it also becomes very clear that scarcity of some resources can be an issue during the playthrough, and it's possible you will not have nearly enough ammunition to destroy all of the mechanical enemies you find, which can result in the need of some, let's call it, creative approaches. The storyline and the goals you're intended to achieve mirror some aspects of the first System Shock, as Xerxes preempts Dr. Polito's plan to restart the main drive of the ship to restore power and blocks certain subsystems from functioning. To solve this issue, you need to find a storage room from which you need to pick up a very specific circuit board that then needs to be installed into the control computer to override Xerxes' control over the subsystems you need to activate. This is very much reminiscent of a portion in System Shock where you needed to find a subsystem of Citadel Station by finding a specific module within a maze. And it seems like some of the design choices in System Shock 2 were made specifically to draw parallels with the first game. The first of these moments is when you exit the tutorial segment and immediately encounter a mutated human enemy, and continue with the AI controlling your surroundings, having closed off the elevators, sending creatures to apprehend you. Even though it could be seen as derivative, I think it's done in a way where the parallels are not just copy-pasted from the first game for the sake of being similar to it, but instead feel more like homages that have been built in a way where they're also unique in their own way, crafting a story with similarities, but in a sufficiently new way to make the experiences overall separate. One of the ways by which the uniqueness of the story is shown happens as you suddenly white out and see unsettling visions of a fleshy mass, within which reside several grotesque creatures, and you hear the voices again.
How can you choose cold metal over the splendor of flesh? But you fear us.
We hear your thoughts, and they rage for your brothers you believe dead.
Slowly the nature of the alien force is beginning to be revealed, and based on the vision and some audio logs, it's possible to deduce that the Many is some kind of a telepathic collective organism, which has likely integrated most of the crew into its mass. However, not all is made clear at all, such as why is the Many lamenting that you're embracing cold metal and helping its mother? Instead of pondering questions there are no clear answers for, the next portion follows the same sequence as before. You run around the level, complete objectives, and finally restore power to the ship's drive, which opens up the elevators and allows you to reach the 4th level and finally meet Dr. Polito. To use the elevators, you merely need to activate a button inside, which opens a new window with clearly marked floors you can choose from. There are two massive changes to the elevator system in comparison to System Shock. First off, you can use one elevator to reach basically the entire ship, which is massively helpful. Second, the purpose of each floor is now marked on the floor selection interface, removing the need for the player to try and remember which number corresponds with which level. To travel to the 4th level, all you need to do is press the button and you're on your way. Well, of course, nothing is that simple in System Shock 2, but at least the 3rd level is now accessible. So, with nothing else to do, that becomes an obvious destination. At this point, a rather massive difference between the System Shocks should become obvious. In some senses, System Shock 2 feels far more linear. Very early on in System Shock, you were able to wander around most of Citadel Station and just explore. This isn't as much the case in System Shock 2, and areas are opened little by little for you to examine, and doing so requires the completion of specific goals. In that sense, System Shock 2 is less of a dungeon crawler by nature than System Shock was, but is more of a narrative RPG. Depending on what you're looking for in a System Shock, that could be good or bad, but personally I don't mind either style. Each of the games play into their strengths, and this somewhat more linear way of progressing through the story does work to alleviate some of the problems I had with the storytelling in the first game. Since being constrained by a set path you need to follow allows the developers to craft certain story beats in more detail, as the player will have to experience things in a certain order. This obstruction, for example, leads you into the Hydroponics sector, where Dr. Polito informs you that some kind of biomass is obstructing the elevator shaft, preventing you from reaching the highest levels of the ship. Not only that, the xenomorphs have transformed some of the areas into incubation chambers, which could be somewhat hazardous to your health. The Hydroponics level imparts a massive amount of lore concerning the Many, as Polito directs you towards a toxin the crew was formulating prior to the invasion's completion, and you explore the level within which new annelid creatures are being bred. I find this area to be absolutely fascinating, and the usage of audio logs is executed almost perfectly. On one hand, you see the end result of what has happened, including new grotesque enemies whose only purpose seems to be to defend the eggs growing all over the level. You also learn how all of this happened, as the Many telepathically conditioned several crew members to feel an irresistible desire to defend and take care of these children. Under the influence of the Many, several female crew members were implanted with cybernetic hardware and instilled with the sole purpose of acting as guardians for their young. It's grotesque, but also completely logical from the perspective of these beings. There is one negative aspect to this portion, as the toxin you need to clear the elevator shaft first needs to be researched. Technically, it could be possible to softlock yourself here, even if you do get enough cybernetic modules to purchase the skill if you don't have it, and that's already a negative, but not my biggest complaint. You can only use the toxin once it's been researched, and research takes time. It's possible to find the locations you need to use the toxin at, but not be able to do so without just waiting and running around finding the required chemicals to complete the research. In a game I've otherwise found fantastic so far, this bit is one of the smaller blemishes. It doesn't help that Polito as well is beginning to get a little impatient with you.
Why do you go so slowly? Do you think this is some kind of game? It is only through luck and my continued forbearance that you are even alive. Now move.
Eventually, you manage to pump the toxin into the air circulation systems around the level, which diminishes the presence of the alien biomass, finally giving you access to the 4th level, where you can meet your only living ally. I don't always do this, but in this case I believe it's more than warranted. A lore dump is imminent, so if you've found the game interesting so far and feel like you'd like to play it yourself, this is the moment to pause the video, click install, and experience the journey through Von Braun. If you don't mind massive spoilers, however, well, here we go. As you open the door to Dr. Polito's office, a morbid sight awaits you. A body is slumped over on a chair with a pistol lying on the floor next to it. If this is Polito, did she get annoyed at you being too slow and decided to end it all?
Why do you go so slowly? Do you think this is some kind of game?
Any questions you may have are soon answered as a voice begins to talk to you, different from the ones you've heard before.
The Polito form is dead, insect. Are you afraid? What is it you fear?
The end of your trivial existence.
The voice introduces herself as Shodan and explains some of her history leading up to and during the events of System Shock. She reveals that the annelid life forms are her creation, an evolved form of the experiments launched into the darkness of space by the hacker. She as well survived, albeit incomplete, as a part of her processing unit was on board the ejected Grove, overseeing the biological experiment. Eventually the Grove crash-landed on Tau Ceti 5 and Shodan had to hibernate to survive. During this time her genetically engineered life forms thrived and evolved, becoming the Many, thus creating their own society and a way of life separate from Shodan, whom they call Machine Mother or Machine Mummy if you're on the internet. She confirms that the Many has used telepathic abilities to take control of the ship and explains that she used the image of Polito to guide you until a certain level of trust was reached, allowing her to reveal herself to you. She also explains that your cybernetic implants are her doing, or as she calls them,
The only beauty in that meat you call a body.
If you value that meat, you will do as I tell you.
She strongly suggests that if you wish to survive, you should follow her instructions, as she gives you 2 tasks. First of which is the acquisition of 3 simulation units, which the Many intends to use to transform the dead biomass of the crew into new killer mutants, which she doesn't intend to let happen. She also says that on the 5th level there's another task waiting for you, and says that you can do these things in whichever order you wish, as long as you complete the tasks. This also means that for the first time in quite a while, the game opens up more and you have options about where to go and what to do, but in a more limited way than in System Shock. I think the closest analog with the games would be the final portion of System Shock, where you explore the last 2 levels. And while you can explore those levels somewhat freely, you have very specific goals to accomplish in order to open up new areas and progress towards the next zone. This kind of design philosophy permeates System Shock 2, and while it can feel constraining, I think it gives the progression more cohesion and works really well for the game. As for Shodan's reveal, I love it, and in my opinion it's executed very well. If you've explored thoroughly, the existence of Shodan should not come as a surprise, even if her role most likely does, since there are several logs detailing how a programming core was located and the science staff led by Dr. Polito was trying to analyze and extract information from it. Eventually, you could also have heard fragmented sounds identifiable as Shodan if you're familiar with System Shock.
I've managed to pull an audio tag file out of its memory. I'll let you be the judge.
Oi, oi, mate. Bloody useless sack of meat. You're knackered just getting around my joint. You can bum around here. Have a good one, mate.
Marie, I think it's speaking English.
There are also many clues to her existence and to the link between her and the Many, even if the confirmation of that link and more details are left for the grand reveal. Even how Shodan used Polito's form to assist the player makes perfect sense, not only because she's an authority figure on the ship, but because Polito was the first and most prominent human contact Shodan had on board Von Braun. This is also an amazing role reversal from System Shock, where Shodan was the primary antagonist, and she was the one trying to take down the hacker. Here, her experiments have a mind of their own and are fighting against Shodan, and she's helping you take down the beasts she created. I absolutely adore this unlikely alliance between a megalomaniacal artificial intelligence entity who still looks down on humanity and thinks of you as inferior, but also realizes you both need each other to survive. Not only has this been a fantastic way to subvert some of the expectations fans of the first game may have had, but the prominence of Shodan as a voice in your ear with a somewhat impatient and forceful attitude very likely birthed a fascination for humiliation in many a teenage player.
But accomplish, human. Disappointment
is not something I will accept from a spec such as you.
From this point onward, Shodan guides you around the ship, completing objectives with the goal of giving her control over von Braun and attempting to eradicate the presence of her rebellious creations. This doesn't prove to be that easy, as the Many has all the knowledge of the crew and control over the ship's artificial intelligence. It seems like every step you take has already been predicted by your opposition, and new threats pop up after every goal you complete. This segment very much mirrors the entirety of System Shock, where every scheme of Shodan the hacker was able to thwart was followed up by another plan that would still cause the destruction of Earth's human population. In my opinion, this works very well, and slowly builds up the level of threat not only to you, but to Earth as well, since it is revealed that von Braun is en route to Earth, and the Many intends to assimilate humanity into the collective. Eventually, even Shodan accepts that the Many has grown to such proportions, both physically and mentally, that drastic measures need to be taken, and her vast intellect alone is not enough to destroy this force threatening both Earth and, most importantly, her. So, you mirror the latter portions of System Shock once more, and wrench control of von Braun from Xerxes, so Shodan can cause the ship to be destroyed, and by doing so, also take out the constantly evolving threat within. To survive this destruction, you need to transfer Shodan to the UNN Rickenbacker, which is still docked with von Braun, take control of that ship, and fly away into the sunset with your new virtual waifu Sylvando. Unfortunately, some of the latter segments of the game don't feel quite as well designed as the earlier portions, and getting into the Rickenbacker forces the player to backtrack to several portions of von Braun, and honestly, kinda reminds me of the override code of System Shock, with the exception that this backtracking cannot be avoided by knowing beforehand you need to collect numbers from certain rooms. There also used to be a portion where it was possible to softlock yourself by hacking a replicator before the appointed time, but at least in the GOG version, this has been fixed. And even if you already have hacked the device once, a new easy hack prompt appears when the story requires you to do so. The latter portions of von Braun also lead to one of the few moments when you see actual living human beings. A couple whose plan to escape can be followed by listening to their audio logs is seen reaching the shuttle bay and escaping von Braun, which is a rather pleasant change from the fate of practically every other character whose stories you can listen to during the game. Reaching the Rickenbacker leads to a segment which can also be rather annoying, as you're tasked to destroy 16 eggs within which a new generation of annelids is growing, ones which Shodan informs you have no chance to survive against if they ever hatch. The reason why this part can be annoying is because you have no map while on the Rickenbacker, and the layout of the military ship is very maze-like. Thankfully, it's not that large, so missing an egg and having to explore the ship again shouldn't take that much time. The UNN Rickenbacker is full of dangers. Being a military ship, every nook and cranny is full of defenses, turrets, robots, and now also creations of the Many. Navigating the maze and trying to survive all of these threats is made somewhat more pleasant by Shodan's constant berating of the player.
Only one egg remains. Insect. Are you always this slow?
What I find very fascinating is that it's very much likely that at this point the player might begin to feel comfortable with Shodan, despite her in essence being a murderous megalomaniac who once had plans to completely eradicate humanity and reshape it in her image. Now though, there's a kind of connection due to a mutual threat and a requirement to cooperate. And some of their lines even give an appearance of her beginning to grow at least somewhat fond of the player's character, her avatar.
You are a remarkable example of a pathetic species. I'm uploading some more cybernetic modules.
Escaping on the Rickenbacker proves to be more difficult than previously presumed, as the many is not merely the hybrid creatures you've been fighting, but also a giant mass growing outside of the ships. One that has expanded to such proportions that it's covering the Rickenbacker and connecting it to the von Braun, making escape impossible. Shodan comes up with a new plan and orders you to take an escape pod and launch it into the body of the many, allowing you to enter it and destroy it from the inside. The body of the many is a somewhat grotesque level and consists almost completely of different kinds of body parts, nerve clusters, sphincters, teeth, and so on, wrapped around scattered pieces of the Rickenbacker, showing how this new biological mass has taken over the ship in a more direct way than previously seen. The audio logs within give more insight into the biology of the many, explaining how these creatures seem to convert various forms of biomass, including human bodies, into nutrients, which in turn is transformed into eggs that spawn varying types of creatures. These creatures don't seem to have much self-determination, but seem to be controlled telepathically by a central hive mind, giving credence to a possibility that if this central mind is destroyed, perhaps that would spell the downfall of the entire collective. The final fight against the brain of the many can be quite difficult, with some of the strongest creatures constantly spawning in the brain chamber, viciously defending their central consciousness. But eventually, the brain falls, and you take the role of a kidney stone, passing through the many's body and getting expelled back onto the bridge of the Rickenbacker. However, instead of living happily ever after with your virtual dummy waifu, Shodan betrays you, as she never had any intention to destroy the von Braun. Now, with her mistake erased, she intends to use the FTL engine of the ship to distort reality and reshape it into her own image. This obviously doesn't seem like a good thing, so one more objective remains: find Shodan and destroy her, once and for all. She has already begun warping the space around her, creating an entry into her lair that is very reminiscent of the virtual world the tutorials took place in. Once past this entry, a familiar sight opens up before you as you enter the medical level of the Citadel station. This final portion of the game is now very nostalgic to me, and I appreciate this choice much more after playing through the first System Shock. Unfortunately, the amazing feeling brought by being able to explore an incomplete version of the Citadel station that Shodan is willing into existence is soon broken by the final battle of the game. Similarly to System Shock, the final confrontation with Shodan is not terribly good, and consists of the player having to hack 3 stations, maintaining a shield around a low-poly representation of Shodan's face, and then you just shoot her in the face a couple of times and it's done. The battle is made even less of an issue if you've saved enough insta-hack items for the final battle. Shodan, knowing she's about to lose, attempts to tempt the soldier with promises of even more power and talks of a true alliance the two could have. But after all this, the soldier doesn't take the bait and refuses the offer, finishing Shodan off while saying a one-liner.
Nah.
I mean, sure, it's not the best one-liner, but is it at least kinda cool?
Nah.
Now with the many and Shodan both gone, the soldier takes control of the ships and signals that the threat has been taken care of, with the von Braun and Rickenbacker now safely en route back to Earth. This signal also reaches the escape shuttle with the couple that managed to escape, and we cut to them, as they are planning to turn back the shuttle and return to von Braun. However, something seems to be wrong with one of them, and we see a silhouette of the woman, looking somewhat like the virtual avatar of Shodan, as her voice changes and we hear a familiar laugh.
What's the matter, lover? Don't you like my new look?
System Shock 2 is amazing, though admittedly I have some nostalgia bias for this one, as some of my earliest memories of being spooked by a video game revolve around System Shock 2 and The First Thief, and those feelings are still strong and fond memories of mine. Unlike the original System Shock, there's not too much to say about the controls, as they are for the most part very much on par with most first-person games released after the turn of the millennium. The one special thing about the character controls is the ability to lean side to side and forwards, which is a rather uncommon feature in video games, and these days often replaced with a third-person mode and a snap-to-cover mechanic. However, there are some curious parts about how the player movement handles the environment, and there are multiple geometric features which can cause a feeling of getting stuck, but these are relatively few, so they rarely affect the smoothness of the gameplay. The level design is for the most part pretty good, and it's easy to feel like you're actually exploring a newly built spacecraft. There are often multiple pathways laid down in a logical way, and many objectives have multiple ways to approach them, which allows for creativity in how the player explores their environment. Due to the nature of the setting, most of the levels don't have much when it comes to vertical level design, which does somewhat limit exploration options. Still, some vertical design is used in clever ways to hide optional pathways, hidden caches, and such, and require the player to properly pay attention to their environment. The Rickenbacker levels are perhaps the most clear exception to the lack of verticality, and might play into the lack of maps in these areas, as the map system is two-dimensional and it doesn't handle multiple layers that well. Since the Rickenbacker levels can be very complex with multiple overlapping levels, this would not be the easiest thing to represent on a purely 2D map. One positive about the maps is the return of map marking, though it's somewhat more clunky this time, as you cannot mark the map within the map interface, but instead press a button to drop a virtual marker at your feet, after which you need to enter the map mode to give it a label. I didn't end up using this system much though, since the levels tend to be more logical and smaller than in System Shock, so I never really felt lost within Von Braun. Most of the levels feel appropriate to the setting, and for the most part it's easy to imagine the purpose of each area you're currently in, of course with some exceptions. For example, the maintenance level maze feels somewhat out of place and very video gamey as an obstacle, whereas the layout of things like the cargo holds feels very logical and seems fitting for a spacecraft. Visual design plays a large part in creating this illusion, and similarly to System Shock, each level has its own visual style to an extent. The contrast between the machines of the ship and the biological life forms of the many is another great aspect of the visual design. From the very first hybrid you encounter, it's easy to see all the things that are unusual and feel wrong. The twisted features, clearly deformed skin, and the weird tube-like extrusion linking the head and the body. You don't know what's going on, but it feels wrong, and immediately gives you an easily identifiable enemy that doesn't fit the general aesthetic of the surroundings. At least until you get further and further into the game, when the presence of the many begins to grow more and more, and the walls begin to show a skin-like organism growing to envelop the steel of the ship. Or at the Rickenbacker, the mass of the many is covering the windows of the ship, blocking your view of space, which had been a common sight on many levels of the Von Braun. The audio design is absolutely fantastic. The ambient sounds of the ship and the sounds of all the machines and creatures you face are distinctive and, to me, effectively quite spooky. One part of the audio that can be pretty divisive is the music, as there are rather large tonal shifts between the levels of the game. Some areas have very pumped up action-y techno music, while some areas rely on more ambient and dark tunes, and it can make the tone feel somewhat confused. Regardless of that, all of the music is in my opinion pretty amazing and brings up images of a dystopian cyberpunk future, which accurately depicts the world of System Shock. The world and the story is where System Shock 2 really shines. Not too much of Earth or the wider culture is explicitly stated, but plenty of things are implied and left for the player to interpret. For example, the events of System Shock clearly had an impact on the Trioptimum Corporation, which at the beginning of the game had its own police force, and according to the intro of System Shock 2 has only recently been relicensed. How that impacted them? We don't fully know, since clearly they were still in business for the last 4 decades in some form or another, as practically the entire Von Braun and its groundbreaking faster-than-light technology is proprietary Trioptimum technology. One clear aspect of the world is a rather traditional cyberpunk trope of hypercapitalism, where corporations wield more power than governments, and freedom is based almost exclusively on personal finances. Even within the Von Braun, a ship that's basically a research and exploration vessel, almost everything for the crew costs nanites, and there's even an entire section of the ship dedicated for shopping and other costly recreational activities such as gambling and even virtual prostitution. Some of the recreational activities have been included as a gameplay element, and it's possible to waste your money on slot machines, or you can find a portable gaming console and cartridges to play on it. The return of Shodan is done quite well, and her story arc and plan is executed masterfully. How she was able to return after her defeat on the Citadel station makes perfect sense within the context of the universe, as one part of her consciousness was separate from the whole when the hacker defeated her goddess persona within cyberspace. The one problem I have is that while her return could be a great surprise, and the reveal where she had been impersonating Polita to guide you from the start of the game been even more impactful. But in a similar way to Ultima 7 and The Guardian, her existence and major role in the game is pretty much spoiled by the box art. Within the game, however, the audio logs and the slow change in Polito's attitude towards the player character build up to the reveal. And even after that, more logs from previous avatars Shodan had attempted to use tell the story of what she had told these people to do, and how they slowly became aware of her plans to take over both of the ships and use the FTL engine of Von Braun to alter reality to her whims. Her creations as the primary antagonist for the vast majority of the game was, in my opinion, a great choice, and the design is fantastically grotesque. Not only that, there is a clear distinction between the machine mother and the many. One of them is a mechanical being working through technology and having to use psychology to manipulate biological life forms into doing her bidding, by appealing to their desire for power, individuality, and the desire to feel special. Whereas the other is a completely biological collective organism devoid of individuality, where submitting to this collective strips people of their own needs and desires as they become a part of the whole, with telepathic powers being used to subtly make people want to be a part of this whole, with promises of bliss and unity. Each organism the many absorbs adds to the collective consciousness and knowledge, which acts as an explanation on how many of the enemies you have to fight are still entirely or partially mechanical, as the knowledge and control of these machines has been transferred to the many through the people who had that control before joining the collective. This also leads to the best subversion of expectations, at least until the very end of the game, where the big bad Shodan is instead a useful ally for basically the entire game. Sure, she's forceful, dismissive, and demanding, but let's be honest here, that's hardly a negative for a lot of people. On the contrary, it's very appealing to a rather notable segment of the population. System Shock 2 also avoids one of the major criticisms I had about System Shock by having your allies and enemies be a constant presence during the game. While in System Shock, Shodan very rarely actually interacted with the player, in System Shock 2, both the many and Shodan constantly contact the player and attempt to either sway them to their side, give orders, or just berate them for whatever reason.
Your flesh too is weak.
But you have potential. Every implant exalts you. Every line of code in your subsystems elevates you from your disgusting flesh.
I firmly believe that Shodan wouldn't have the kind of classic villain status with the merits of System Shock alone, and the more prominent presence of the AI in System Shock 2 is a key part in her becoming as iconic as she is. Another subversion of player expectations is done through the character of Captain Diego, the son of the self-interested secondary villain from the first game, who does start off as one of the first minions of the many, and is in many ways responsible for the entire incident happening in the first place, having succumbed to the influence of the collective. But unlike his father, this Diego redeems himself towards the end of the game, and physically mutilates himself to rid the alien infestation from his body, ultimately acting as a helpful entity at the final phase of the game. The ending of the game is the one part that to me is a bit of a weak point of the story, similarly to the very abrupt ending and lackluster final fight of System Shock. The ending was trying to be very 2000s cool, but even back then, I found parts of it quite cringe.
Nah.
What I do appreciate is the cliffhanger at the end, as it does leave room for a sequel with more Shodan, but in a new way we know absolutely nothing about. Considering this very curious fate for at least a portion of Shodan's consciousness once again, I'm glad we didn't have to wait too long for a sequel and, well, crap. Oh well, at least System Shock 2 has a secret which allows the player to find out the true mastermind behind the Von Braun incident, the revelation of which might be a surprise to basically everyone. The change into a slightly more linear RPG from the more freeform dungeon crawler was in my opinion a very good choice. There's still a lot of exploration to be done, but it's more directed than in System Shock, which should make the game more accessible without simplifying it to an extent which would draw the ire of more critical gamers. The RPG system itself is pretty decent, and it's very hard to create a build where you've completely screwed yourself over. Even taking weapon skills you never end up using isn't a game breaker unless you're playing on the higher difficulties. But if you're playing on those, it's most likely you're already familiar with the game and have an idea of the build you want to have. The system does scale itself if you play the multiplayer mode, by lowering the amount of cybernetic modules each player receives, requiring the players to specialize more onto specific tasks. I didn't get footage of this mode for the video, but multiplayer is basically the same as the single player mode, but you can play with a friend. It's quite fun. One aspect of the specialization includes the different weapon types, of which there are 4. In a single-player run, it's pretty easy to max out 2 or 3 of the weapon specializations, allowing for a wide range of variety, which isn't as easy during multiplayer due to the reduced amount of modules to upgrade your skills with. The variety of the weapons is pretty satisfying, ranging from very basic weapons such as pistols and shotguns, which have a variety of uses and different ammunition types, making them very versatile, to energy weapons which are especially effective against mechanical enemies, to heavier weapons, and finally exotic weapons, which are practically weapons created by the many. These ones have to be researched and take the form of a curious mix of biology and technology, reminiscent of the film Existenz, for example. Finally, there are their PSI powers, which is arguably the most difficult path to choose. But the addition of basically space wizards is still a very interesting and welcome choice. All of this allows for a variety of character builds, which leads to more replayability. One negative aspect about weapons is how they seem to wear down extremely fast, and even a weapon in perfect condition can degrade near breaking point after shooting a few measly magazines, practically forcing the player to invest in the maintenance skill to be able to use firearms effectively. Overall, I absolutely love this game, but as mentioned previously, there is a layer of nostalgia that I can't avoid. Would I recommend trying the game? Absolutely. This is what inspired games such as Prey 2017 and BioShock, and in my opinion still holds up pretty damn well, even if the 3D models do look quite dated and some of the graphical aspects very clearly show their age. But the overall audiovisual direction, in my opinion, still manages to maintain a very tense and awesome atmosphere of you being alone on a spaceship trying to survive against all odds. As much as I've sung the praises of System Shock 2, even if some parts of it could still be better, the story of the developers is not the happiest. Since, despite gaining immense critical praise and becoming a cult classic which inspired many other future games, System Shock 2 didn't sell particularly well, which was very likely a contributing factor to the eventual bankruptcy of the developer. The whole franchise ended up on an almost 2-decade hiatus before Night Dive Studios brought back System Shock and gave us the enhanced edition of the first game. By the time this video comes out, an enhanced edition of System Shock 2 has been announced and teased, but no release date has been set. Despite the rather tragic end of the original developers, the 2020s has brought us a resurgence of the franchise, and there is still one more game to play to finish off this retrospective series. And that we'll look at in the next video. I'd like to thank all of the Ko-fi and Patreon supporters. Thank you all for your continued support. It means the world to me. And knowing so many people appreciate what I do is absolutely amazing. But until next time, Fintrovert signing out.